Hello. My name is Michael Chin. I'm the author of the novel My Grandfather's an Immigrant and So Is Yours, that is coming out September 14th from Cowboy Jamboree Press. I'm recording this a bit in advance, and so it may already be out by now, or the pre-order might already be happening. So regardless, hope you'll check that out. But this podcast is called So Is Yours, and I'm talking to some authors who I really admire, a little bit about their work, and kind of to tie in with the novel, talking a little bit about family and how they may have come to influence identity or work or anything along those lines. Today I'm lucky to be talking with Ann McBee. I came to know Ann through her work. She published a short story collection, How Rabbit Went Down, and Other Mishaps. We are small pressmates that came out with Hoot and Waddle Press in a similar time frame to when my book Circus Folk came out with them. So I picked up a copy of this at AWP some year back when we were in person for such things, and just loved the collection. I taught the story from it, Learning to Fly, in a class in the past. This summer, I'm actually teaching the whole book, or at least a fair portion of it, to another summer seminar on speculative fiction. So I'm really excited to actually get to speak with Ann real time for the first time in this interview here. So before I blather on any further, let me turn it over. Ann, I'd love if you could just kind of introduce yourself, maybe tell us a little bit about you and kind of how you would sort of frame your identity, your work, how you'd like to say kind of hello to the world.
Okay, well, my name's Ann McBee, or Ann Stewart McBee. Was born in Michigan, actually. I was born in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I started writing probably when I was 5 or 6. So I've always been a big writer. I actually did a lot of reading because I was born with rheumatoid arthritis. So I, couldn't always keep up with the other kids as far as playing and running around. So I did a lot of reading, and I think that got me into writing. So I was already, into writing when I was a kid. And I eventually went on to get a PhD in creative writing from University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. And it was there where I wrote a lot of the stories that are in How Rabbit Went Down. And that was published, I think, in 2019. And right now, I'm actually in Iowa, outside Des Moines, Iowa, teaching at Des Moines Area Community College. But I've been teaching off and on mostly since the year 2000, when I went to Oxford, Ohio, to the University of Miami, Ohio, to get my master's. And that was my first teaching job. And I've been mostly teaching writing ever since. And it's perfect because I think teaching writing helps me grow as a writer. So that's been really important to me.
No, that's great. You've hit on a lot of points I actually want to ask you about. So I'm glad you kind of laid the groundwork for everyone to understand kind of where we're going in this interview. But yeah, I guess, one of the things I wanted to ask, just as kind of a gateway, because, I kind of got to know you through this book before any other terms. And there's so much material in here. There's stories of, a speculative nature, as I mentioned earlier on, where there's sort of some magical realism or kind of unusual happenings going on. There's commentary on celebrity culture. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about kind of, what inspired these stories, kind of, what are your influences, what got you thinking about these things, and kind of what motivates you as a writer to engage with all of this material that personally I just find kind of fascinating. I think it's sort of often outside the box, it's very literary in nature. I think it's very interesting, but it's sort of engages with the world and sort of through some unexpected lenses. So I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of, your thoughts on that.
Well, a book that was really, really influential to me, like a huge influence on me, was Toni Morrison's Beloved. And I read that as an undergrad, and I think I read it again as a master's student. I think I read it again when I was doing my PhD program. So I read it a bunch of times, and her style of writing, but also just this notion of, like you say, unusual happenings. It's hard to point it out. Is it magic? Or, is this considered like a fantasy genre? But it wasn't either one of those things. But yet you obviously had a presence in that book that was, I guess you could call it supernatural or paranormal or something. And so but it was really about, you know, kind of collective history. And so I got interested in the notion that a lot of the things that, you know, such as memory and love and just things that we can't fully explain, we know they exist and we put them as real things, but we can't really define them. We don't really know where they come from. And to me, that lent to this idea that maybe there is magic and that it's actually just an everyday thing. We maybe don't acknowledge it, but that's why we have things that we can't explain, like why you fall in love with a certain person, or what it means that, you know, you have this long history and this memory, and it's those people are gone, but they're not. So to me, that was just really informed a lot of, you know, my decisions to include strange incidents. And it really is, it's a real feeling or a real emotion or a real struggle, but it's manifesting itself as some kind of monster or magical being or magical presence.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and it sort of leads to the other question I was thinking about in terms of, you know, learning to fly. I think that was, you know, at least on my first read, my favorite story from the collection, the first one I wanted to teach. And I think a big part of what you're talking about there, where sometimes it's not so much that something inherently supernatural or make believe so much as the way to understand an idea is better represented by something that's sort of more magical in nature. At least that's how I kind of read that story is, you know, women in this story, in this family lineage, have special abilities, that they choose not to show them because they know that subjugated for them. And it reads like a really kind of impactful statement about sort of the way women can be kind of subjugated in, you know, Western culture and other cultures as well. I shouldn't limit it to just Western, but, you know, regardless, you know, maybe I'm reading a little bit too much in, but I'm curious about, you know, your thoughts on the kind of the making of this story and kind of, you know, what you wanted to say and why this was the appropriate, you know, kind of prism to put that through.
Yeah, that story was inspired by, I had a friend who was in a similar situation as the character in that book. So she was kind of an inspiration, but also, you know, her situation and, you know, a lot of women in relationships that I'd observed, including myself, that sort of, you know, this idea that the ideal woman is, you know, meant to be a mother and is devoted to her children. And that's, you know, that's part of who you are. And that's your identity. And I don't have kids myself, so I'm trying to like understand, you know, what it would mean if you were in that situation, and to get out of it also meant leaving your child behind, and what that would entail. And sort of the idea that she becomes, I want to say that she has the abilities of a fairy to fly and move around and do things, but it's not that exactly. It's not anything that exists really in any, you know, kind of canon, but it's like you say, it's a manifestation of just something that can't be spoken. And also the notion that women, there's something of a power in women that doesn't get recognized. You know, I love the movie The Witch, and even though you could say a lot of that is kind of misogynistic, it also kind of points to the notion that women have an inherent power they're born with, and that, you know, other people can exploit that power, but women have to kind of hide that power. And the notion that you don't want to say that becoming a mother might diminish a woman's power, because that's kind of, oh no, you know, women are supposed to be proud of being mothers and that's supposed to be our big accomplishment. But I thought in some cases becoming a mother also has this way of diminishing a woman's power too. So you have to acknowledge that, you know, being a mother is magical in and of itself, but also there's a sense in which, you know, you lose some of that power in giving yourself to your children. And for her to embrace this power she discovered, she has to leave them behind, which is really, really sad and heartbreaking. But at the same time, it's not necessarily an unhappy ending to that story either. Right. So that was kind of, you know, I was wrestling at the time with the notion of whether I wanted to have kids and what it would be like if I did become a mother and sort of my fears of what a terrible mother I would be. So I was like, kind of, that ended up in the story. It's again like something you don't want to say outright, but if you can say it with a magical element in a way that's almost more true than any way you could have expressed it in a more realistic fashion.
Yeah, I know that's really well said. And, and I think, when I first read the collection, I think I was probably about a year and a half, 2 years into parenthood myself. And I can relate a lot to what you're saying. Just with, my wife is a, strong feminist who, is more educated than I am, is more capable in many ways than I am. And I consider myself a feminist. And yet, in having a child and caring for the child and seeing how the responsibilities end up breaking down, unconsciously even, it's surprising to kind of, fall into these patterns of, what we grew up with, or kind of, more traditional, so to speak. I'm using air quotes that the listeners can't see, but roles that we kind of fall into. Where yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It's such a conflicted thing where, it's such an important part of, our lives at this point, and yet something we consistently grapple with in terms of, what are our identities now, and specifically from a woman's role. That's something that I'll never fully be able to access. But yeah, I think that's really well said on your part. But yeah, and there's one other story from the collection I wanted to zero in on, although I'd be happy to hear about others as well if any of them tie in. But the title story, When Rabbit Went Down, it has such a potent connection to New Orleans specifically. And, I've been in New Orleans only once. I went there for a New Year's trip, and you got just a little kind of taste of the city. But, it felt so lived. It felt like the city was an integral, almost character in the story. And I was just curious if you could learn a little bit about kind of, the genesis of that story, and maybe the, the role of that city and the culture that you capture in the story so well.
Well, this is a great story, actually. We went to AWP. I was getting my master's, and this was at University of Miami at Ohio. And I had a good friend there. She was maybe 10, 15 years older. She'd been divorced. She had a couple kids, got divorced. She was a party girl, and I'm still a party girl, even at that time, she was in her 40s. I think I was in my 20s. And I was definitely a party girl because I was, 25 years old, whatever. And AWP that year was in New Orleans. And so we went down, my friend and another friend of ours, we went down to New Orleans, and I think we went to maybe a couple, I know we went to the keynote speaker, although I think it was Dorothy Allison, but I can't remember for sure. And then maybe a couple other, but otherwise we just went down there and just debauched, and we were just, I remember I was kind of sick. I had a cold. Otherwise I would have been even worse. I would have been really over partying. But one night we were out in the French Quarter, and this was before Katrina, so everything was the same in New Orleans as it had been in a long time. And we were out, oh God, it must have been, I don't even know, it might have been 4 or 5 in the morning. And we were kind of lost. We didn't really know where we were. And our hotel was out in downtown area somewhere. And we were just kind of looking around to try to figure out how to get home. And then this young woman drives up in a Cadillac, driving through the quarter, which normally there's no cars. It's just a walking area. But for some reason, she's driving through. And she's a Black woman, probably in her 20s. And my friend, she's like, hey, girl, give us a ride. I'm like, what are you doing? We don't know who this woman is. Never met her. But she's like, give us a ride. So the woman says, okay, good. She gives us a ride back to her hotel. And, my friend, she's still wide awake. I'm almost dead. And she's still wide awake. That's pretty fun tonight. And the woman says, I'm selling pussy. And we thought she was kidding. We're like, oh, that's, your U card. And we're, what are you really doing? She's like, I'm selling pussy. And so we were like, oh, okay, well, why don't you come back to the hotel with us? And, hang out. And we bought her a carton of cigarettes, I think, and filled her car with gas for her, and she drove us home to the hotel. And then she went, you know, she left and we never saw her again. Her name was Deja, which I think is the character's name in the story. And it was just such an odd, it was one of those moments where it felt like weird and just like magical and strange that we met this person just randomly when we needed a ride. And at the time, you know, one of the fun things we were doing in New Orleans is checking out, you know, the voodoo stuff, which I was just kind of interested in because I'm interested in that kind of thing, obviously. And when we got back and I was taking our fiction workshop seminar, and they said, you know, you need to write a story that uses research. And at that time, I was bad at the internet, like I didn't even know really how to use it yet. So I was thinking, oh, research, that means you have to go to a library and look up books. So I just looked up a bunch of books on voodoo. Because I said, I'm going to write a story related to what happened to us in New Orleans. But it's a story about sexuality too, and about how women's sexuality it's constantly, like you're constantly being kind of exploited for your sexuality and objectified, but at the same time told that it's something that as a virtuous woman you should not acknowledge, or you should not engage in. You should be available, but not too available, and you should pretend to enjoy it, but don't really enjoy it. And it was kind of just a conflicting thing that I was interested in at the time because I was a young woman and I was single, and I was kind of discovering myself. So a lot of the themes in that story are informed by that also. So it was kind of an intersection of things that I learned through my research, air quotes again, about voodoo and our experience in New Orleans, which was just, I don't know, I just thought that to be really a magical moment. And there's a moment in that story when and I can't remember if I kept this in the story, where the narrator or the main characters are mistaken for prostitutes.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, that happened too. We were just sitting down and two guys came up and thought we were prostitutes. They're like, "Do you want, well, how much?" We're like, "What?" And again, you know, just made me think a lot about, you know, how much we judge sex workers as well. You know, it's kind of sex workers are ultimately essential to the fabric of our society, really, and yet they're not. They're outlaws, and they're considered bad people, or fallen. They're the fallen people, right? So all that was kind of informing, again, a kind of thing that's hard to express in a way that really is truthful without using magic to do so. So the figure of Madame Laveau, and those are all figures for that same sort of mystery. It's a mystery that we can't talk truthfully about without manifesting it in a magical way.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's really insightful on the genesis of that story. So no, thank you for that. And just, I'll probably cut this out, but just as a tip off, when you lean, I think it's to your left. The audio gets a little bit more fuzzy. So okay. I think it's still good enough that we caught pretty much everything from what you were saying. But just as a heads up on that, because it's great content. I want to make sure we hear that. But
okay.
But great. Oh, well, so stepping away from the book a little bit. I know that you're a teacher of writing. At the collegiate level. And that's something that I'm doing too. I've been doing it for about, I think it's like 6 or 7 years now. And so something that I've been thinking about a lot throughout this whole process is the interplay between teaching and writing, and kind of how they kind of enhance each other, and how it makes me think about my own process and all of that, but also how it complicates it, right? Because every now and again I make the self-bludgeoning mistake of kind of doing a tally of, well, how much did I write this week? And it's like 10,000 words of feedback to students, 1,000 words of creative work, and whatever freelance stuff I've been doing at a given time. There definitely is a cost to it, right? I mean, publicly facing, we're talking to our students, we usually try to, emphasize the positives there, or at least I do. But, but there is certainly a give and take to that. So I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about kind of how, teaching and writing kind of complement or inform each other, and also how they might complicate one another in different ways.
Yeah, I think that learning about writing or learning, teaching helps you stay fresh because you're constantly grading, right? So you're constantly looking at writing that's flawed and formulating in your mind how to let that person know, that student, that it's flawed. You didn't provide enough context, or you didn't, you're not being specific enough. And things like that are similar to the kind of things you have to consider in your own writing. So to me, even the grading part, which to me is the most tedious and also most time-consuming part of teaching, is also, I think, part of what helps me stay fresh in my own writing and be able to formulate sentences that do what writing is supposed to do. And also just, it forces you to read a lot because I'm constantly having to find reading for my students.
Yeah.
So I find these articles for them to read, and that forces me to read and stay up on that. And so it's just, teaching writing is just a good way to stay with writing, because you're constantly having to look at writing, think about ways to revise writing, think about ways that, you can go wrong or right with writing. So teaching writing is a great thing to do for a writer, but it takes up a lot of time.
Yeah. So
I have had to tell myself that, there are moments where you're going to you should be working on making your class better, or you should be working on, planning ahead for the semester, or, you should spend a little more time engaging with student comments. And I've actually gotten my commenting time, my grading time down really low. And that's because I've had to say, you need to prioritize your writing. As much as you're not often being paid for it, and as much as, the people might say, writing is not your job, it's a hobby, right? It's not serious. I sometimes even catch myself saying, like, when I'm writing something and my husband says, "Are you working?" Meaning, are you grading or are you planning your class? And I said, "No, I'm playing," because that's what writing is, it's playing. But I've decided that, if I'm going to get any writing done at all, I need to prioritize it as if it's work. So I do that. I've cut back on, and I've had to take away from time spent on students to do that. But I've told myself that, if you need to write, and I do need to write, just to stay alive, I have to prioritize it. And that means I have to stop kicking myself when I'm maybe not, spending as much time grading as I should, or maybe I should have commented on this more thoroughly, or maybe I should comment on every little activity they do, and I should comment on it to give them thorough, to make sure I covered all the bases. And if I did that, I wouldn't have time to write. So I've said, here's the limit to my grading commenting, and I'm putting that limit down because it's not playing. Writing is about survival for me. So to me, yes, I only get paid for the teaching, but that doesn't mean writing isn't necessary. So I've just had to prioritize it.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. I have one of my friends from grad school, Dennis James Sweeney, who's a poet and fiction writer. He had a great commentary on that once, where he was talking about how I would need to invest like 90% more effort to make this class like 5% better at this point, like the give and take and the amount of effort versus actual output from it. And yeah, the point at which we have to draw boundaries and say, like, no, I am a writer, and that's where I'm going to, draw my energy from. That's kind of what I want to be doing. Not that teaching isn't important, and not that we shouldn't be, putting effort into it, but yeah, there's a point at which, the line should be drawn as well, right? Where we have our limits as human beings. So that's really well said. But yeah, and you mentioned this in your introduction, but about rheumatoid arthritis and that being something that you've dealt with throughout your life. And I think part of what drew me to your book, I was looking at several other books at the Hoot and Waddle table and saying I'm going to buy 2 or 3 books while I'm here at the table at AWP, and reading your bio, and it said something to the effect of that you have rheumatoid arthritis. It doesn't limit your ability to write any more than it affects someone's ability to breathe in polluted air, or something to that effect. I'm butchering the phrasing of that, but it's sort of, I really appreciate the frankness of that, and sort of something that as someone who has the privilege of not dealing with that condition, I didn't really think about much going into it. But I'd love to hear a little about kind of how that may have impacted your creative life, or maybe more to the point how it has not impacted you, for those who might not have really thought about this much.
Yeah, so, well, like I said, writing came to me at a really young age, and part of that came from reading. And I read all the time, and I'm still to this day, if you could get paid just for reading books, that would be my job. I would just do that. But part of it is reading takes you out of your body. So if you deal with chronic pain or chronic fatigue, not just with rheumatoid arthritis, but with any condition that, causes pain or causes difficulty movement, then reading gives you, puts you in the consciousness of, a narrator or writer or character. And it takes you out of that space where you're like, sort of, I don't want to say imprisoned, but limited by your pain. And limited by, your physical limits, that your body's just not able to do certain things. And this is cliche, and this is what, you say to kids when you're trying to force them to read. It's an escape, it's a journey, but it really is, because, when I was in a book and I was wrapped up in the story and in the character, I would forget about pain, and I would, it wouldn't matter what my body looked like or how it was functioning, because I was in that space. So writing became, for me, a way to sort of create my own version of that journey, or that escape. So a lot of, writing I did a lot of like a horror writing when I was a kid, because I liked scary movies. And it's just, to me, I wrote to have something to read a lot. Not that I didn't have enough books to read, but it was like, at the end of the day, I'd like to write something else. Here's an idea I have this is a book that I'd like to read, so I'd write it. But also I think that poetry in particular, but fiction too, it's healing. It allows you to, express what is unexpressible. So it's hard to articulate the type of pain a person is feeling. Pain is just hard to describe. And it's especially when it's kind of an underlying, because after a while, if you're born with something like RA and you have pain from like toddlerhood, it relegates itself to like a corner of your brain, and you learn to, I don't want to say erase it, but just selectively delete a response to it. So it's, you often don't realize how much pain you're in, because your brain has figured out a way to cordon it off. But you still know that pain is there. And a lot of it too is just, the difficulty of going through life when you're disabled. Like, the world just isn't constructed for people who are disabled. It's just not. So you're constantly having to tweak the way you do things. And then people will look at the way you do things like you're doing that wrong. And I'm like, no, this is the way I have to do it, because my hands don't work. It's like, I don't know if you watch Breaking Bad, but there's a scene in which Walt is telling Walt Jr., who is paraplegic or cerebral palsy, and he's trying to teach him how to drive. And Walt Jr. keeps putting his right foot on the gas, or the left on the brake, like he's not using just the right foot like you're supposed to. And Walt keeps yelling at him like, you're not doing it right. And Walt Jr.'s like, this is the way I have to do it. And he's like, well, you have to learn the right way, or you're not really driving. And Walt's like, then I guess I'm not going to drive, because this is the way I have to do it. If you want me to be able to drive, I have to do it this way. And it's the same when you have RA or anything like that, where you know, I have to do certain things with my teeth. And people watch me do things with my teeth. They're like, what are you doing? Oh my God, don't do that with your teeth. I'm like, if I don't do it with my teeth, I don't do it. So I'm doing it with my teeth, and I have huge teeth. I have that going for me. So like it's kind of that same trying to express to people what it's like to be disabled and operate in the world. And it's again, it's hard to express, and it's hard to express that feeling too of knowing that you're different, but not being able to articulate that, because I didn't declare myself disabled until I was much older, because I was told that you should never say that about yourself. That's like a bad thing. Like, don't say you're disabled. You know, don't ever say that. Don't declare that. So I never called myself a disabled person, even though I was, because I thought that that was bad. Like, you weren't supposed to say that. Like, that was like saying, condemning yourself. And I only recently learned, like, that's actually kind of an empowering move to declare that. But for years, I had to work on, okay, how do I articulate without saying it what I'm going through? And that, I think, inspired me to be creative and try to defamiliarize the way you say things, which is an important part of writing, making something that's familiar to people, unfamiliar to them. So, but also it's tough because my hands are total garbage. Like, it's over the years of damage, my hands are they're not worthless yet, but they're pretty bad. So it's interesting because writing involves typing. So I have to type, and I've tried the Dragon speaker, but it's not the same. Like, I don't think in speech. I think in words on a page. So I have to type. So it's interesting the way, you know, you have to not just make time because teaching takes time out, but also because fatigue and pain also takes time away from my writing. So I could easily, fatigue is actually the bigger problem, but it's tough to make time for writing because I do get tired. And the pain sets in too. If I'm writing for too long, I have a flare up the next day. So it's been inspiring, but also challenging. It's tough to be a writer when your hands don't work.
Okay, well, no, so thank you for discussing that, because again, I think it's that sort of thing where, if we're in the privileged position to not deal with it, that we don't think about it very often, and so, really insightful to hear about kind of your experience. But so, as a tie-in to, my new book, again, called My Grandfather's an Immigrant and So Is Yours, as the title would suggest, it deals a lot with sort of family legacy and sort of different kinds of inheritance and, things along those lines. And so, I'm always interested to talk to folks about the role of their family life, in their creative processes or in their identity. Full disclosure, my own family isn't very involved in my creative life. I had a grandmother who was very encouraging, which I think is part of where some of the ideas from this book came from, and part of where I think about family in those contexts. But nonetheless, I have, a dad who I don't think has ever read a piece of fiction that I've written. I don't really expect to, and that's fine, right? We kind of learn to kind of who people are in our lives, and what their roles are, and so on and so forth. But in any event, I just was curious to ask, maybe starting with grandparents, if there was a relationship there, but otherwise, family members who you feel were sort of important to, you as an artist, and or just you as a person and kind of your identity now.
Yeah. So I was really close to my grandmother, but I wouldn't say she had much of an influence on my writing. My mother was a poet, so she was really huge into poetry. In fact, she was a nurse, and then she became a nursing professor. And she actually taught a seminar on the intersection between poetry and healing. So she was very encouraging of my poetry in particular. I don't think she or my dad understood my dad has read it, but he's like, I don't get it. And I'm like, that's cool. That's fine. But my mother's mother, my grandmother, and my grandfather passed away when I was a teenager from Parkinson's. But they were Seventh-day Adventist. And I don't know if you know much about it. It's basically Christianity Protestant Christianity, but with a leaning toward the Old Testament rules about things. So they go to church on Saturday instead of Sunday. So that's a big thing. And then the other big thing is they believe that when you die, you don't go to heaven right away. You go to heaven after Jesus comes back and takes everybody up in the apocalypse. And then everybody goes up in a big crowd at once. Like those are the two differences. So that was kind of interesting. It made me think about different perspectives and how a lot of people, think that their perspective informs the world. But as somebody who grew up in a Seventh-day Adventist tradition, I realized that, you're actually kind of a different person because all your friends go to church on Sunday. But if you ever go to church, my mother and father, we didn't really go to church, but if I went with my grandparents, it was on a Saturday. But my grandmother was actually a really neat lady. She got a PhD actually, and she was born in like 1919, so that's kind of impressive for a woman of her time. But she taught the children of like migrant workers and the poor workers, biology, and she would like teach classes. So a lot of them were migrant workers or the children of African American families who are working. And so she was an inspiring person. But as far as someone who influenced my writing, I would have to say my mother, big time. And we actually wrote a poetry book together. She had some poems and I had some poems from when I was young. We kind of combined them together and put them together in a book. And the Nursing Alumni Association, where she taught, published it for us. So my mom and I kind of had a little book together. But so she was a huge influence on my writing. Like she very much encouraged it. And she kind of gave me permission to do it because she was a career woman and worked full time and also took care of the house and took care of us full time. My dad, he worked and he was there and he contributed a lot, but she did, like most women, she did kind of the lion's share of the work, but she still found time to write poetry. And so she passed away in 2014. And that was right after we had put the book out. And so that's kind of an interesting story, the way my mother's poetry, because she had me reading a lot of poetry. And my father's mother actually gave him up. She had him when she was 17. He gave him up, and then he was adopted by some relatives of hers, and then they died, like in a car accident. But when he was 15, he went into the foster system, and his birth mother tried to get in touch with him, but he was angry. He just ripped up her letters. Like, no. And then years later, like I kept bugging him about it because it's weird when you don't know who your grandparents are.
Right.
It does feel like you're missing half of your identity. So I pestered him a lot about it. Like, if you know if she's still alive, would you ever be interested in like seeing who she was? Like, because I'm kind of interested. And eventually he did, and he got in touch with her. And when he was about 50, he actually got in touch with his birth mother, who had remarried and I gained 3 uncles and an aunt and 2 cousins from that. So that was kind of an interesting story. We don't know anything about his dad, and his mother would not say, like she refused to talk about it. So I don't know if it's a sad story or what happened. So there's still kind of that hole there. But it is an important part of your identity, like you're missing something, because I discovered later that because my grandmother has this pancake recipe, we always called it pancakes, but it was different. It wasn't the same as pancakes you would get at a restaurant, and I realized later it's like a German Dutch version of the pancake, But they never talked about being German or Dutch or anything like that, because they were part of a generation that's like, oh no, we're American and that's what we are. And whatever roots we have, we're ignoring them. We're pretending they're not there, even though they are there. And it just sneaks in, with the pancake that you make. That's not like a normal pancake.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting to hear, and I really appreciate you sharing all that. In part because I call the podcast and so is yours. In part, tying into my book and kind of being cutesy, but also because I expected that most folks I interview here, there'll kind of be some surprising kind of connections and overlaps and whatnot. And not to go too far into my own story there, but there's some interesting parallels just in sort of missing kind of family lineage. There's a grandfather on my mother's side who I don't know anything about. We found late in my grandmother's life that she was a product of an affair. She told my mother that he had passed away before she could remember him, just when she was really little. It turns out, no, he was around. He just wasn't in the family. So there's that piece of it. And then on the Chinese half of my family, there's always been kind of a language barrier and a distance barrier and whatnot. They lived, they lived in the US. They lived, whatever it was, about a 5-hour drive from where I grew up. So I saw them, 2 or 3 times a year growing up. But there's always been sort of a divide of, kind of culture, not really fully understanding, but similar to what you were saying again, just sort of a part of how they raised my dad was sort of like, no, you're American, like we're just going to leave this stuff behind. And then in turn, all the more so, I didn't grow up learning the language or, much about the culture at all. And so I've always felt sort of like I have one foot in sort of this world of, being, third generation, and this other foot in, I know nothing about this culture that, represents my last name and my hair color, but not much else about me. So it's really interesting to see those kind of, unexpected overlaps. And thank you so much for sharing. But yeah, and we're kind of in the home stretch here, and at this point, I just want to kind of turn things over to you. If there's anything, new creative projects or things you're working on or something like that you might want to plug, or else things you just want to refer listeners to that we maybe didn't talk about in the interview, but is work that might be interesting for them to look at after they listen to this.
Well, right now it's funny because I was working on a project on a book for a long time, and I'm still committed to it. But I kind of hit a wall with it, and it's a collection of, I'm calling it a commonplace book, because it's dealing with fraudulent artifacts, which is, I don't know if you've heard of it. I forgot the author's name. Dang it, I should have written that. It's writing that appears to be something else. So it's a story, but it's in the form of an interview.
Right. Okay.
It's in the form of a crime report or something like that. So I put a bunch of those together, and it's poetry, some of it's flash fiction, some of it's stuff that could be fiction, could be poetry, could be something else, all based on the same character. And I was compiling that together, and at some point I kind of slowed down a bit and kind of like hit a wall with it. And I compiled it together to see where it was. And it was about a little more than halfway to book length, but I kind of struck a wall with it. And part of the problem was and this is kind of embarrassing, but why not? I was a big Game of Thrones fan, and the show ended. And so I was like, oh, Game of Thrones is over. You know what? I'll read the books. So I read the books that they're based on, finished those in like over a summer. Like, okay, the books are gone and there's no more books. And it's like neither project, the story didn't end either way, like the story didn't end. And so what happens to me is that a character talks to me, and the character of the book that I was working on is called Sam. His name's Sam, and Sam, he still talks to me, but who really wouldn't shut up are the characters from Game of Thrones. Tell my story. I'm like, no, I'm trying to tell Sam's story. Oh, tell me. What about me? What happens to me? So I just kept like imagining different outcomes for these characters that I didn't create. But then I noticed that a lot of my students were into fan fiction, like talked about it, wrote it all the time, did a ton of it. It was all they wanted to do. And I was like, that's fine. You want to write fan fiction, whatever. But then I thought, okay, since these characters won't shut up and won't leave me alone, and I'm putting a wall with Sam's story for now, maybe I'll just set Sam's story aside for now, and I'll try fan fiction because my students love it so much. They're constantly talking about it. It's kind of an interesting notion of borrowing and you know, the idea of borrowing someone else's as an inspiration to your work. So I was like, okay, maybe I'll write down some of the things that I've been thinking about. But I told myself, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to make it a scholarly project. I'm going to go in with the intention of exploring what fan fiction explores, which is this idea of utilizing other people's ideas and being inspired by other people, other writers. So I started writing a fan fiction, which is on Archive of Our Own, which is a, you know, one of the famous fan fiction sites. And I started doing it, but in every chapter that I write, I include a snippet that's been readapted from something else. So I'll borrow from some of the movies that I liked as in my youth, or I'll borrow from other books. I'll borrow from Shakespeare. I'll borrow from, you know, one of the old Greek histories, and I'll just sort of incorporate that into the story and then cite it. Like, this comes from some part, and this comes from a Game of Thrones episode, or this comes from that. And then, so that'll be kind of an exploration of the way we are influenced by what we've seen and read before. And what I found is that I'll be writing and then accidentally borrow from something and not even realize that I did it. Because I'm consciously trying to do that, I'll realize it later, like, wait a minute, that is from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. That is from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and I didn't even know that I took it. And so what I discovered is that, you know, you borrow things without knowing.
Sure.
Called cryptomnesia. You don't know that you are stealing something because you forgot about it. But that a lot of, and then when I go back and read how Rabbit went down to kind of look through it, I noticed that I do that in there too. And a lot of times it's something my husband said to me that I stole, but a lot of times it's from something I watched or something I saw or read, and I ended up stealing it, not realizing I was stealing it. So it's making me discover the extent to which we end up borrowing, maybe not even intentionally, even while at the same time I'm intentionally borrowing somebody else's characters to write this fan fiction. So I've been really kind of in the last chapter I published, I made 23 borrowings, 23 separate borrowings in that last chapter. And a lot of them I wouldn't have credited if I hadn't been consciously taking note of it. So that's what I've been working on while, and I've told myself if another book comes out, then I'll just put that aside and I'll go back to Sam Dwyer, who was the character with the Commonplace book, and I'll go back to his story because I'm still committed to that, and I've still been working on it too. And that story, he's a teenage boy who has not psychic powers, like he can't predict the future, but he can tell what other people are feeling. So his stepfather ropes him into being like a revival healer, because he can guess what's wrong with somebody. So he can guess if someone's dealing with cancer, he can guess if someone's dealing with arthritis or with bad acne. So he's used in these revivals to make it look like, you know, God is speaking through him. So that's his story, which, like I said, I put aside temporarily to write this fan fiction, which, you know, I think we're told that that's not real writing and that it's not, you know, that we're supposed to be embarrassed by it. I kind of am, but at the same time, I'm kind of like, it's kind of an interesting journey because of what I've noticed or what I've learned about borrowing other people's work.
No, I think that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, because I often tell the story of, you know, when I first started writing stories when I was like 6 years old, it was video game characters I was borrowing from, because I was a Nintendo obsessed kid and started wanting to tell my own stories about these characters. And my sister, actually, who's now a writer as well, but took a more circuitous route to it through studying physics and education and being a painter for a while, ended up kind of falling in love with the Twilight books of all things and starting writing fan fiction based on that, which led to a career writing romance novels. It's just under a pen name now, so I won't embarrass her any further in case she does listen to this. But nonetheless, you know, I think it's foundational to a lot of kind of what we think about and how we understand the world. And I think you're exactly right that we, pretty consistently borrow from whatever tradition we're working in, or not even necessarily in the tradition, but just from all these different places, especially now that pop culture is in such an accessible place where I could watch, any TV show from any given era if I really wanted to, in the next hour. I can, unconsciously have that seep into the way I'm thinking creatively and plot lines and all of that. So yeah, I certainly think, and as someone who teaches writing as well, yeah, I think that that's one thing I would, tell any aspiring writers out there or students of writing. It's real writing, right? I mean, you might not be able to, publish under exactly the same terms, and some snooty academics might turn their nose up at you, but I mean, it's still the same, basic practices of, putting words down and, creating and, making characters make choices. So, yeah, I think it sounds like a great project and something I'd love to look into a little bit more. So thanks for talking about that. But okay, well, I have kept you for, nearly a full hour at this point. So, thank you so much for everything you had to say here. And, I look forward to sharing this with anyone who is willing to listen. Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to chat again sometime.
Yeah, congratulations on your book, Mike. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Oh, thank you very much.